In my programme yesterday, I discussed at some length the various reports which had appeared in the Western media, specifically the European media, over the course of yesterday, though eventually the American media also started to cover the same reports. There was what purported to be an exclusive report in the Wall Street Journal, which as far as I could see was in essence identical to all the others. All of these reports, all of which claimed the same thing, that Ukraine had captured the village of Rabotino, as was claimed by Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar on Monday, and that the Ukrainians had actually managed to penetrate or pierce the Surovikin line further south or somewhere to the southeast. And I said that I found it difficult to give any credence to either claim. There seemed to be a large amount of reports, evidence from the Russians, including from Russian reporters whom I had previously found reliable, that the Russians were still present in Rabotino, that control of the village, of this particular village, continues to be contested. And I also said that there was also strong reasons to doubt Ukrainian claims that the Surovikin line had been reached, much less pierced. Anyway, today I noticed that reports of that kind about the capture of Rabotino, of the piercing of the Surovikin line, they've largely disappeared from the media in Britain this morning. You can still find articles like this in the US media, but they are basically leftovers, as far as I can tell, from the reporting yesterday. So, as of today, that type of reporting about Rabotino being captured, about the Surovikin line being pierced, that's all melted away. And instead, the British media has been carrying more pessimistic articles once more, which I will come back to shortly. But anyway, let's first, before we get to those and look at the overall political situation, let's discuss the news on the battlefronts. And the first thing to say is that it seems to me overall as if the situation is static. There aren't any major advances by either side. The Russians have got very close to Kupiansk. There's some reports that they're gradually pushing the Ukrainians back away from Sinkovka, this village very near to Kupiansk, but they seem to be making no attempt at the moment to storm eastern Kupiansk, this area of Kupiansk, east of the Oskol River. Why they're waiting to do that? What is the cause or explanation for this? Well, we'll come to that for the moment, but anyway, there's been no information, no evidence of any big Russian advances on the Kupiansk or Oskol fronts. Further south, around Bakhmut, in the Bakhmut area, there is more news, and here it does seem as if the Russians are indeed on the attack, and they do seem to be pushing the Ukrainians back in a number of places. But here also, one can't talk about a general Russian offensive. What seems to be happening is that the Russians are taking advantage of the fact that Ukraine has pulled back troops from the Bakhmut area to concentrate them in the Zaporozhye front lines, as demanded by the Western powers. The Russians are taking advantage of that. They're taking advantage to regain lost ground, to strengthen their positions, their defensive positions, to push the Ukrainians further back from Klashayevka, this village that the Ukrainians have been trying to recapture ever since the beginning of May, from Kurdyumovka, another of the villages around Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, as the Russians call it. There seems even to be some fighting in a village called Andreevka to the southwest of, well, I will call it Bakhmut for the purposes of this program, of which there were reports that some weeks ago that the Ukrainians had captured Andreevka. The very latest reports suggest that either the Russians have recaptured Andreevka or that the Ukrainians perhaps never captured it in the first place, or possibly I'm misunderstanding the reports. But anyway, there does seem to be fighting in the area of Andreevka itself, and the Russians do seem to be advancing in that area also. Now, as I said, these are local advances. There's no general Russian offensive. There doesn't seem to be any serious attempt by the Russians to push on towards Chasov Yar to capture villages like Khromovo and Ivanivska, close to Bakhmut, which is still under Ukrainian control. But anyway, for the moment at least, in that area, it is the Russians who hold the initiative. Of course, the big tantalizing question is what actually is happening on the Zaporozhye front lines. And as I said, yesterday and the day before, and indeed for several days, lots of talk in the media in the West about Ukrainian advances, about Ukraine being finally in full control of Rabotino. This is what Hanna Maliar, Ukraine's deputy defense minister, claimed on Monday. I've said that there's good reasons to be skeptical about that claim. And there were lots more claims about the Ukrainians having pierced the Surovikin line somewhere to the southwest of Rabotino. Well, we have had more information, or at least more claims, about what's going on in this area. They all, however, all of the ones that I've seen come essentially from the Russians. Ukrainian officials, including Hanna Maliar, talk about Ukrainian advances, but they're not providing any real details, and it's difficult to get a clear picture from the Ukrainian side as to what is going on, or at least that is true as of the moment of making of this program. But this is what the Russians are saying. Firstly, they're saying that despite my own belief yesterday that the Ukrainians had largely given up on attempts to capture Rabotino itself, it seems that the Ukrainians have made more attacks in the direction of Rabotino. And Yevgeny Belitsky, who is the acting head of the Zaporozhye regional government. By the way, before I proceed, I should quickly say that Belitsky apparently is planning to regularize his position by holding local elections in Zaporozhye region, the Russian-controlled area of Zaporozhye region. Elections which, of course, will not be recognized in the West. But anyway, putting all that aside, Belitsky said that this morning there'd been a big attack by Ukraine towards Rabotino. There are around 200 men, Ukrainian soldiers, that's about 2 companies worth of troops, advanced towards Rabotino on foot. They'd driven up in their vehicles some distance from Rabotino. They then climbed out of their vehicles. They tried to move up the high ground towards Rabotino, and they tried to storm this village. And according to Belitsky, they were attacked by Russian artillery, Russian machine guns, by the Russian troops, who he and every other Russian commentator insist, the Russian troops who are still in Rabotino, in the southern part of Rabotino. According to Belitsky, this attack by these 2 companies of Ukrainian troops was repelled, and Belitsky claims that the Ukrainians suffered appalling losses. Now, he says 200 men were involved in this attack. He claims that out of those 200 men, 156 were killed or injured, which I have to say seems to me a fantastical number. I can't believe that 3/4 of an attacking force would have been killed or injured in that kind of way. By the way, for what it's worth, that claim, that last claim, makes me wonder about Belitsky's entire description of this attack. And it did cross my mind when I read it that perhaps he's inventing a battle that never actually happened. But there have been other Russian commentators, more reliable Russian commentators, who have also spoken of Ukrainian attacks on Rabotino, which have been unsuccessful. Clearly they are referring to the same attack or series of attacks that Belitsky is talking about. And I suspect ultimately that, as I said, those Russian troops are indeed there, still in Rabotino, that there was a Ukrainian attack or series of attacks, and that they were all repelled, essentially, as Belitsky says, and that he's gilding the lily a little by claiming that Ukrainian losses are greater than realistically they could have been. So, Rabotino, according to all of these reports, still largely, or at least to a certain extent, under Russian control. Contrary to Ukrainian claims, the village is still not captured by Ukraine. As I said, all of the big league Russian reporters and commentators say the same thing. These are people often bitterly critical of the Russian government and of the Russian authorities, military authorities, people who have shown sympathy in the past to Yevgeny Prigozhin when he criticized the Russian Defense Ministry, people who have been reliable in accurately reporting Russian defeats and setbacks when they have actually happened. And I can't believe that all of them have been fooled or are lying. It would be completely inconsistent with the way in which they have been reporting this conflict up to this point. So it seems to me Rabotino still, at least to a certain extent, under Russian control. Ukrainian claims to have captured Rabotino, clearly wrong, and Ukraine continuing to make attempts to capture Rabotino, perhaps not on the scale that Belitsky says, perhaps not experiencing the losses that Belitsky says, but nonetheless, Ukrainian attempts to capture Rabotino, but those attempts continue to be unsuccessful. And according to other Russian commentators, this time not Belitsky, but other commentators, including people like Ryba and others, also Ukrainian attempts to push on and to try to capture Verbovoye. And I suspect that those claims about a Ukrainian breakthrough of the Surovikin line relate to fights, Ukrainian attempts to push on to try to capture Verbovoye. Now, Verbovoye's position relative to the Surovikin line is tantalizing because, as I've discussed many times, I'm not a person who finds it easy to read maps to any great extent, but to the extent that I can, it seems to me that the confusion about the piercing or alleged piercing of the Surovikin line might have come from the fact that Ukrainian forces have been trying to push or break through towards Verbovoye, which appears to be either just behind or on the Surovikin line, and it might have been that these fights, these battles towards Verbovoye, are what people are misconstruing as a Ukrainian advance beyond the Surovikin line. Now, I say that. I should say that Russian reports have described this fighting. They speak of small groups of Ukrainian infantry, 15 men at a time, launching attacks towards Verbovoye. Perhaps some of them are able to get through tank obstacles and that kind of thing. But anyway, all of the Russian reports are unanimous in saying that all of these attacks up to this point have been repelled, and that the Ukrainians are making no progress at all in this area towards Verbovoye or anywhere else in this area of the battlefield. And there's also a general agreement that Ukraine is increasingly attacking with infantry, that armor, tanks, heavy vehicles, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, are infrequently used now in these attacks which are taking place. There are claims by the Russians that Ukrainian artillery has been operating in quite large quantities, but that the armoured vehicles have not been. And whilst that does enable Ukrainian troops to approach the Russian lines, obviously an individual soldier makes a less easy target than a tank. It does mean that when the Ukrainians do get close, they do suffer higher casualties. Now, alongside all of this, there's been lots of pictures now, increasing numbers of pictures of burnt-out Striker wheeled armoured personnel carriers belonging to the 82nd Air Assault Division of the Ukrainian Army littering the landscape. As I said, it's not wholly easy to get a complete picture of what is going on. But for the record, my own understanding is that Verbovoye remains firmly under Russian control. The Surovikin line has not been breached in any place, or even properly reached in any place. Rabotino itself remains under Russian control. The Ukrainians have been trying to launch attacks in this area of this bulge or salient that they've carved out, as I said, within the control zone ahead of the Surovikin line, but they've not managed to make any progress beyond it. And of course, by advancing or putting troops into this area with the Russians controlling all the high ground around it, they're exposed to Russian artillery strikes, and as a result are experiencing heavy losses. That was my assessment in my program yesterday, and it continues to be my assessment today. Now, as I said, it's contradictory reports. We'll see whether the situation, the assessment I've just given, holds up. But it is interesting that there's been much less talk. In fact, there's been no talk at all in the British or European media that I've seen, at least certainly the British media that I've seen this morning, about Ukrainian breakthroughs or advances towards Tokmak or Melitopol or any of that sort of thing. In fact, if we now come back to the British media, which was heavily pushing these stories yesterday, we get an altogether much bleaker picture of the course of the fighting. And in particular, there was a long article today in The Guardian by Frank Ledwidge. Frank Ledwidge has written for The Guardian before. He's a lawyer, but he's a former military officer who served in the British Army in the Balkans, Iraq and Afghanistan. He's written some interesting and insightful articles for The Guardian in the past about the West's problems in supplying shells and in producing shells in sufficient quantities to sustain the Ukrainian army. That problem of shell production, as I've discussed many times, has never been solved. He's provided sometimes more optimistic articles. But his latest one suggests a generally bleak view. And the title is "Time is Running Out for Ukraine's counteroffensive. Its allies will be crucial in what comes next." And the subtitle goes on to say, with no military breakthroughs and a US election looming, the West needs to unite around an achievable goal for the conflict. And the article then begins. It is quite clear now that there will be no sweeping gains from Ukraine's counteroffensive. While it has not failed, it has in no way resembled the kind of swashbuckling victory hoped for by optimists. This should be no great surprise. It was always going to be a slog, a series of bite and hold operations, more First World War Western Front than some latter-day blitzkrieg. Western officials now fairly bluntly state that there will be no breakthrough of well-dug-in Russian lines anytime soon. The Ukrainians are also facing a developing threat in the east as the Russians advance in the direction of Kupiansk, a situation described as complicated. And then there is a long discussion about the problems that the West has and some very measured criticisms of US policy and of Ukrainian policy, skepticism about as long as it takes, the mantra that comes out from the United States about as long as it takes, comments about Taiwan and the fact that the United States might eventually have to refocus on the Pacific, the difficulties the United States faces over the fact that the election is now coming, and also the United States election is now coming, and that the American public is becoming more skeptical about US support for the war. And there's even a discussion of the recent comments by Stian Jensen, who is Jens Stoltenberg's Secretary General, about Ukraine having to trade land, territory, in return for peace and eventual NATO entry. But the last, most important paragraph is the last one. He introduces it in the penultimate paragraph by saying that the West needs to unite around a workable, saleable, long-term plan and an achievable end state. And of course, the key words are workable and achievable. And then he finishes with the war likely to go well beyond next year. We need to look coldly at not just where we are as friends and supporters of Ukraine, but where we are likely to be in 2, 3, or 10 years. We must also bear in mind the vital fact that the enemy, in other words, the Russians, get a vote. In other words, it's not just enough for the Western powers to do what Eve Smith discussed in that brilliant article she wrote in Naked Capitalism weeks and months ago about the fact that the West always negotiates with itself before presenting a peace plan, and that the peace plan which is eventually presented then falls apart because it is not acceptable to the other side. Liubridge is making the point that the Russians, whatever is put forward, has to be something that the Russians are prepared to work with. You can't just offer the Russians proposals which the Russians are bound to reject, however reasonable or acceptable they appear to be to yourself. So here we are. We see Ledwidge, coming forward with an article which, frankly, in the context of so much that has been written and said, including in The Guardian especially, by the way, certainly shows a strong element of realism. I would add that Jeff Roberts, the historian, has also given a wonderful interview in which he makes essentially the same point. And Jeff Roberts, in particular, reiterates that the space, the time for a negotiation, a viable negotiation, may be closing. This autumn, after the Ukrainian offensive has run its course, may be the last opportunity for negotiations. Beyond that, the Russians might decide to launch an offensive. It could be that an exhausted Ukraine, with its army run down and no longer getting the kind of military support from the West that it previously had, that Ukraine will finally collapse under the pressure, in which case the Russians will simply dictate terms and there will be nothing for the West to do, and the outcome would then be a huge debacle. And if you take a step back and think about what Ledwidge is saying, and he's saying it in The Guardian, he's essentially making a similar point. You have to come up with something that is achievable. You have to look at the situation coldly, in other words, objectively. You must put your emotions and your feelings to one side, and you must understand that the Russians will have a say. Ultimately, they have to be persuaded that any peace deal is in their interests and will work for them. And given all that's happened up to now, that is going to be a very, very tough prospect indeed. Winning the Russians now is going to be a very tough prospect. Anyway, that's The Guardian. There's been another article in the London Times discussing the fighting in Kherson region. And this has been an interesting article because it doesn't talk about the politics, but it accepts that in Kherson region, in this area, in the fighting along the Dnieper River, Ukraine has been very heavily outgunned. It talks about how Kherson city is now being relentlessly shelled by the Russians, that the Russians are still there on the other side of the Dnieper, just a short distance away. It makes no reference, by the way, to these Ukrainian attempts to try to establish small footholds east of the Dnieper. I get the sense that even the Ukrainians have given up on those. There's been reports, not in this article, but in Russian channels, that the Russians have been quietly retaking control of some of the islands in the Dnieper River. But this article in the London Times does suggest that in military terms, the only way of Ukraine can stabilize the situation in Kherson, prevent this Russian shelling of Kherson, these constant Russian rocket and missile attacks, not just in Kherson city, but in all of Kherson west of the Dnieper River, which Ukraine nominally controls. The only way that can happen is if there is a Ukrainian breakthrough on the Zaporozhye front, of which, as we have seen, for the moment, there is no sign. So another bleak article, bleak piece of reporting about the state of the war, this time about the situation in Kherson region. And that, it seems to me, is a fair summary of the situation on the front lines. Now, I did say at the start of this program that the Russians seem to be biding their time about an attack on Kupiansk. It's important to stress, I don't know how large the Russian forces close to Kupiansk are. It's not clear to me what the Russians are thinking or planning to do there. It's clear that they've not launched yet any outright assault on Kupiansk. Now, there's various possibilities. I floated one yesterday that they're not attacking Kupiansk because they're satisfied with the situation in Zaporozhye. They want the Ukrainians to continue to concentrate their troops along the front lines in Zaporozhye, where the Russian army is systematically defeating and destroying them, and that they don't want the Ukrainians to have the excuse of a Russian offensive in the north to pull back their troops from Zaporozhye and relocate them to Kupiansk, where they might interfere with the bigger Russian offensive which is coming. Now, that's just my theory, and as I said, it's not a military person. It might be wrong. A military person might say that it makes no sense at all. Or it could be that there just aren't that many Russian troops close to Kupiansk, that the Russians are working towards launching a bigger offensive towards Kupiansk, that this will be part of this offensive that Russian officials like Belitsky and the Chechen commander Akhti Alaudinov have been talking about, and that the Russians are just biding their time and building up their forces, and that this offensive will take place, and that it won't just be Kupiansk that is recaptured, but that it will all form part of a much larger offensive, aiming perhaps to re-establish Russian control over large areas of Kharkiv region, and also put pressure on the Ukrainian positions in northern Donetsk region, around Slavyansk, and those other places. So it could be that. There is a third possibility, which brings us back to all this talk in the West about negotiations. Maybe the Russians are waiting for the Ukrainian offensive to run its course, and they're waiting to see what the West does. Will the West try to continue to support Ukraine, or will they make some kind of peace proposal to the Russians? Maybe it's the Russians biding their time, waiting, playing a waiting game, playing a game of cat and mouse, not just with the Ukrainians, but with the West as well, keeping the West guessing, making the West unsure, playing a waiting game, playing a war of nerves with the West. And here there's been some rather interesting comments from the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, because Lavrov has disclosed some information about a briefing he has received from the Saudis about the talks in Jeddah that took place at the beginning of August, where there was supposed to be a meeting of various interested states to discuss Zelensky's peace plan, which, as I've discussed many times, isn't really a peace plan at all. It is a demand for Russia's unconditional surrender, which will then supposedly open up scope for talks, but it's not clear at that point about what. Anyway, it's clear that there was no agreement in Jeddah around Zelensky's peace plan. Apparently it was barely discussed. I've said that the whole Jeddah proposal seems to have been authored by President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. The Jake Sullivan was perhaps hoping that the Jeddah conference would take place against the backdrop of a decisive Ukrainian breakthrough towards Tokmak and Melitopol, and that it would you could use the Jeddah talks as a springboard to try to get the Russians to basically capitulate and accept a settlement of the war on American terms. Anyway, whatever the purpose of the Jeddah summit was, according to Lavrov, the Saudis have told him that they spent most of their time over the course of the talks trying to get the Americans and the Western powers and the Ukrainians to understand that a diplomatic process to achieve a settlement of the war is impossible if the Russians are not fully engaged, if they're not participating. And that it was a mistake, therefore, to hold the Jeddah conference at all without the Russians there, and that in future the Russians must be present if there's to be any prospect of a negotiation, of a successful negotiation, and of a diplomatic settlement and an agreement to end the war. Now, what the Saudis tell Lavrov would have been said in confidence, or so one would assume. The fact that Lavrov is disclosing it in the way that he is strongly suggests to me that the Saudis and the Russians have agreed that this needs to be disclosed, and that this is a gentle way of maybe not such a gentle way, a way of reminding the Western powers that negotiations must take place with the Russians, and that, to go back to what Ledwidge is saying, that the Russians get a vote in the talks, in the negotiations about how to end the war. That if there is going to be a workable, saleable and achievable long-term plan to arrive at a sustainable end state, the Russians have to be persuaded to agree. And when Ledwidge uses words like workable, saleable and achievable, obviously he means that it must be a plan that can be sold to the Russians. So, I'm going to suggest that this is partly an explanation for these very strange moves, these very strange statements about the Surovikin line having been pierced, about Rabotino having been captured, that we've been seeing over the last week or 10 days. There's growing alarm, or so it seems to me, amongst some people, both in Kiev and probably in Washington, that with the offensive not going well, pressure is growing behind the scenes for a negotiation, a serious negotiation, a proper negotiation with the Russians about a sustainable and achievable end state. And I think it's understood that this will have to go well beyond the Istanbul Agreement that was rejected by the West last year and which was sabotaged by the United States and Britain, that it means the loss by Ukraine at the very least of the 4 regions, and that it will also mean that Ukraine will probably not be joining NATO, and perhaps not even the EU either. There's been more discussion about the fact that there is no consensus or agreement on the part of the West, or indeed even in discussions between the United States and Ukraine, about Ukraine's famous security guarantees. The United States is unwilling to give, apparently, any security guarantees that would commit the United States to taking direct steps to confront the Russians if there were to be a future war between Ukraine and Russia, which of course defeats the entire purpose, from Ukraine's point of view, of security guarantees. And given that the United States, or at least some more level-headed people in the United States, are not prepared to go there, and given the realities on the battlefronts, pressure for the negotiations is perhaps growing and will no doubt continue to grow. And again, to reiterate, there are growing problems about arms supplies to Ukraine. Now, in his last programme, Brian Beletic on the new Atlas has done another one in his masterly series of breakdowns of the latest arms package for Ukraine from the United States. And as he rightly says, it is very thin. We're told that there's going to be more 155mm and 105mm ammunition, but we're not told how much. We're told that some more Javelin and TOW missiles, anti-tank missiles, will be supplied, but again, we're not told how many. We're told that there's going to be more HIMARS rockets supplied to Ukraine, but again, we're not told how many of those. We are provided with no breakdowns of more supplies of armoured vehicles. No more Bradleys, no more Strikers in this particular package. This despite the fact that we're seeing, as I said, so many pictures of Bradleys burning on the steppes, so many pictures of Striker wheeled vehicles burning on the steppes, increasing numbers of burning or burnt out Strikers now starting to appear. But no more of those. Importantly, no more reports of more Patriot missiles being supplied to Ukraine. And Brian Beletic has correctly made the point that it can't be because Ukraine doesn't need more of these missiles. It's because these missiles are in extremely short supply on the part of the United States, and it's likely that there aren't any of these left. Now, some people will say that the reason that this package is so thin and so small is because the United States is running out of money. The drawdown authority has become almost exhausted. The United States, the administration, is largely out of funds. It's used up the massive allocation made last year by Congress, and there's no agreement yet from Congress to extend it. I have to say, I don't take those sort of things at all seriously. Briefly, if the United States, if the administration wanted to fund more sales, more supplies rather, of weapons to Ukraine, well, it would engage in a little more creative accounting, as it's done up to now, and it could no doubt do it. The fact that it is not doing it suggests that resources are now so depleted that the United States is becoming, the Pentagon is becoming more and more wary of continuing to invest more resources in what is clearly a failing enterprise. No word of ATACMS missiles being supplied to Ukraine. Apparently these are also in short supply, and they're needed to confront China in the Pacific. The word now is that the F-16s are unlikely to appear on the scene in any quantity before the end of next year. Even the summer of 2014 is now looking optimistic. it's perhaps worth pointing out that as of now, only 8 pilots from Ukraine are being trained to fly these F-16s. And if there were any plans to bring out, enlist NATO mercenaries, ex-pilots to fly these planes, well, that doesn't seem as if it's going to happen. Perhaps these pilots are not that keen. They don't particularly want to take on the Russian Air Force with its much more powerful and advanced fighter jets with their incredibly powerful long-range missiles. So, no F-16s for the moment, less weapons from the United States, and supplies of ammunition, artillery ammunition, running very short. And from Germany, situation also isn't looking terribly good. It seems that the Germans are trying to put together an arms package to send 20 more Leopard 2 tanks. Losses of Leopard 2s have been very heavy, but if that is indeed what the Germans are planning to do, I suspect that will be the last significant delivery of Leopard 2s. The stress from this point onwards, the emphasis will be on supplying Leopard 1s. Leopard 1s, old Cold War tank, developed in the 1950s, brought into service in the 1960s. There's lots of trouble putting Leopard 1 package together. Switzerland is refusing to release 100 Leopard 1 tanks to Germany. Germany's going to Greece, trying to get Greece to agree to part with its Leopard 1 tanks so that those can be sent to Ukraine instead. But perhaps more importantly, it seems that these tanks have been so long out of use, at least by the German army, that it's having to turn to retired soldiers who operated these tanks in the 1980s and 1990s to come out of retirement or to come out of their current civilian jobs in order to train the Ukrainians in how to operate them. Now, there is a delivery of Abrams tanks, which is on its way. Apparently, there's just 10 of these tanks at the moment in Europe. The Ukrainians are training on them. But I don't think anybody seriously believes that 30 Abrams tanks is going to make a decisive difference. So we can see that all of these factors that Ledwidge and others are flagging are coming into play. The Ukrainian offensive, despite all the claims, isn't working. So it's understandable why there is pressure. There's probably mounting pressure for peace talks. But peace talks are something that some political figures in the West and in Kiev will want to resist to the greatest possible extent that they can. In Ukraine itself, reports suggest that President Zelensky's ratings are now collapsing, that the Ukrainian people are tiring of Zelensky. They no longer believe in his claims of victory. There have been some rather sharp comments from some of Zelensky's advisors, people like Podolyak, in effect criticizing Ukrainians for losing their faith in the war, which is an interesting development. And you can see also the stress that other Ukrainian officials are now under. So Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, a strong hardliner, he had an angry exchange with EU foreign ministers. He basically told them to stop criticizing Ukraine over its conduct of the offensive. He continues to rule out any negotiations with the Russians. This was clearly an acrimonious and unhappy meeting. And frankly, he looked he looked stressed and unhappy and was using undiplomatic language, which it was perhaps unwise for him to use to a group of countries that are his paymasters, or Ukraine's paymasters. And there's even reports now that even in Poland, the mood is now starting to shift. The doubts about Poland's open-ended support for Ukraine is growing, that the ruling party, the Law and Justice Party, is starting to lose support and is coming under pressure, and that there is a rising mood in Poland that Poland has overcommitted itself to the war, and that this is starting to work its way through into the polling in advance of the election in Ukraine. Lastly, there could be a possible shift of mood in Britain. And here I think we need to be very careful, because Ben Wallace might be out of the scene, but I've no doubt at all that his successor, Grant Shapps, who has now taken over the British Defence Ministry, is going to be outwardly every bit as hardline as Ben Wallace was. But it's important to say that Grant Shapps, unlike Ben Wallace, does not have a military background. He is a civilian, and it may be that he is not quite as engaged in this issue of Ukraine as Ben Wallace was. Ben Wallace seemed to have adopted the cause of Ukraine as his own, a fact that seems to have caused tension between him and some US officials in the Pentagon. Tension which it looks like cost him his job, and certainly cost him his prospects of being appointed NATO Secretary General. So maybe some doubts in Britain, and I would add that Grant Shapps' appointment as British Defence Minister suggests that some talk that Dr. Liam Fox, a more hardline figure, somebody with historic contacts with the British military and military industries, there was some talk some time ago that he might become the next defence minister. The fact that he hasn't been appointed and Grant Shapps has been may suggest that someone in London also has come to the view that maybe it's time to walk back a little. Though I want to stress again, don't expect any significant change in British policy. Now, all of this pressure, as I said, is going to be very unwelcome on the part of some people in Kiev and some people in Washington. And the reason is, at least in Kiev, that one senses that if this war ends in a compromise, if it ends in a peace settlement, which is not going to look like a victory, or which is going to be impossible to sell to the Ukrainian people as a victory, then the political positions, the position of most of the Ukrainian government, the current Ukrainian government, will become untenable, and the current government will lose power. And of course, in a country like Ukraine, a loss of power might also have severe consequences. At the very least, there could be corruption allegations, and corruption investigations, and other things like that. So the Ukrainian government, putting aside the ideological perspectives of some of its members, probably would not welcome peace talks at this time. They will want to extend the war, at the very least, and hope that something can be turned round, and that's presumably why they're moving instead towards mobilization. And of course, the same will apply in the United States. Now, there's been a very good article, joint article, in which Daniel Davis, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, is one of the co-authors, in which Daniel Davis and his co-author pointed out that back in July 2022, last year, President Biden wrote a op-ed in the New York Times. I remember it well, in which President Biden said that the United States' purpose was not necessarily to enable Ukraine to achieve its maximalist objectives, but to put Ukraine in a stronger position in future negotiations. I remember that op-ed very well. At the time it was published, I actually briefly imagined that it was a sign of realism in the United States and on the part of the administration. Unfortunately and sadly, those hopes were misplaced. And the point that this article makes by Daniel Davis and his co-author is this: the United States arguably had placed Ukraine in exactly that position, a position where it was in a strong position to conduct negotiations following the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives in the autumn of last year. And General Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, actually said as much. He actually made comments to the effect that this was the moment to begin negotiations. Ukraine had reached a position of relative strength. It was unlikely that that point was going to be sustained. This is the moment to talk. And, as the article points out, that didn't happen. Instead of following through on the logic of President Biden's own op-ed, the administration instead decided to help Ukraine achieve total victory. It pressured its European allies and agreed itself to supply Ukraine with all kinds of heavy weapons in order to put Ukraine not in a stronger position in which to negotiate, but in a position where it would launch what it was assumed would be a successful counter-offensive in Zaporozhye region, which would then enable Ukraine to dictate peace, to impose victory conditions upon the Russians. And that opportunity last year for negotiations from a position of relative strength was lost. And the co-authors of this article then make the further point that now that it looks as if the counteroffensive is going to fail, the argument has been turned round again. So whereas the Ukrainians didn't need to negotiate in the autumn and winter because they were in a position of such great strength after their successful counteroffensives, now they're in a position of weakness because their offensive looks like it's going to fail. So, of course, we put off negotiations again. And the co-authors make the point that if you follow the twists and turns of this logic, either Ukraine is in too strong a position to need negotiations or in too weak a position to negotiate successfully, and therefore you will never get any negotiations off the ground at all. And in the meantime, without those negotiations, Ukraine's position just goes on getting weaker, the Russians go on getting stronger, Ukraine loses more territory, it gets attritioned away, but that's the trap that you have boxed yourself into. Now, I think this does describe precisely the thinking of certain members of the negotiation of the administration. including, I'm sorry to say, the president himself. I think in any position where President Biden believes himself and Ukraine to be in a position of strength, they will not be able to resist the temptation to try to make the position stronger still by launching more offensives and doubling down on more support for Ukraine. Whereas President Biden will never agree to negotiations, or will find it impossible to agree to negotiations, as will other members of his team, and as will the government in Kiev, if it looks like the negotiations are going to be of the kind that Frank Ledwidge is advocating, negotiations that will produce a workable, saleable, achievable plan acceptable to the Russians. It's all or nothing. That op-ed of last summer, like so much else that President Biden says, didn't in the end really mean anything. And that, of course, explains, together, as I said, with the concerns that the Ukrainians have, the strange messages we've been getting over the last 10 days. The offensive isn't succeeding. You're under pressure to negotiate, so you don't want to agree to negotiations. So pretend that the offensive is succeeding after all. Say that the Surovikin line has been pierced, and note the first claim to that effect, that the first line of defense, first line of Russian defense had been pierced, wasn't made from Ukraine. It was made by a US official, none other than Mark Milley, in fact, before the Ukrainians claimed that they'd fully recaptured Rabotino. So, claim Rabotino is captured, even if it hasn't been. Claim that Ukraine is pushing through the Surovikin line, even if it hasn't done so. Suggest that Verbovoye is on the verge of being captured by Ukraine, even though there's no evidence that that is the case. Pretend that all is going well. Put off talk of negotiations. Wait until the autumn rains and the Rasputitsa come, and then wait until next year and then see what comes. So I wonder whether this isn't ultimately what explains these very strange moves over the last 10 days or so. Anyway, one way or another, I think that pressure for negotiations is going to grow. The fact that the Saudis and the Russians are saying this, talking to each other, saying that the Saudis, confirming that the Saudis were telling the Western powers that there have to be, any negotiations have to involve the Russians. I think that this is going to become an overwhelming demand before very long from across the global south, and probably increasingly for some people in Europe and even in the United States. And sooner or later, negotiations, some kind of approach to the Russians probably will be made. It's far from clear to me, however, that when it does happen, that it will offer a workable, saleable, achievable plan. And again, to borrow words from Ledwidge, I'm afraid that it will always fall short because there really isn't any consensus in Washington or in NATO to achieve the kind of proposal that Ledwidge is talking about. So there we are. A mobilization, attempt to hold on longer, plan, to the extent that there is a plan, to try to keep the war going until November next year. Fingers crossed, hope for the best. That seems to be all that's left. And in the meantime, pretend that things are going well, even though information from the actual battlefronts appears to tell the contrary. That's, it seems to me, where we are in the war at this point. Anyway, in the meantime, the rest of the world continues along its path. President Erdogan is now on his way to Moscow. He'll be there on the 4th of September. Or not Moscow, I should say Sochi. He's going to be meeting Putin in Sochi, what is essentially Russia's summer capital. Putin has a large residence there. He often receives foreign visitors there. So Erdogan will meet Putin in Sochi. They're going to have detailed negotiations. As I anticipated, the Russians are offering to cut the Turks into the Russian grain export trade. They're apparently offering the Turks 1 million tons of grain in substitution for the grain deal. I suspect that such a deal will eventually be done. And I also get the sense that the Russians and the Chinese are now working overtime to smooth ruffled feathers in India over the fact that neither Putin nor Xi Jinping are going to attend the G20 summit. As I said, don't be surprised if sooner or later what I discussed yesterday in my program, an offer, for example, to set up a secretariat, a BRICS secretariat in Delhi or some other Indian city, materializes. It is likely that there will have to be a BRICS secretariat before very long, and locating it in India has obvious attractions. And meanwhile, continues to be confusion and uncertainty about what is going to happen, both in connection with the coup in Niger and the coup in Gabon. Now, I'm increasingly getting the sense that the military leaders in Gabon are taking a more measured approach than the military leaders in Niger. This seems to have been more a coup against President Bongo of Gabon and his family, who, as I said, have run Gabon since the 1960s, rather than a real attempt to change Gabon's geopolitical orientations. But it's clear that in Niger, the relations between France and Niger are now deteriorating. Niger has cancelled, or at least the military government in Niger has revoked the French ambassador's diplomatic immunity. They'd asked him to leave. Macron refused to invite him back to France. So he's been stripped by the authorities in Niger of his diplomatic immunity. One wonders whether in those sort of circumstances he can actually stay. And the military leaders in Niger have also cancelled the military relationship with France. And so far, there is still no sign of an ECOWAS intervention force entering Niger, despite much talk of this. Perhaps the coup in Gabon has unsettled some ECOWAS leaders and has stirred up doubts there. But a potential crisis in West Africa has, of course, by no means been averted. And one senses again that relations between the United States and China are on a deteriorating course once more. The United States, or at least the administration, has tried to get some kind of diffusion of the situation with China underway over the last few weeks. Secretary Blinken went to China. Secretary Yellen went to China, had talks with Chinese leaders. But it's clear, at least to me, that President Xi Jinping's decision not to attend the G20 is because he doesn't want to be put in a position where he has to speak and meet in person with President Biden. And apparently President Xi and the Chinese leadership feel sufficiently strongly about this that they're prepared to ruffle Indian feathers by making the decision to stay away. And by the way, I think that explains President Putin's decision to stay away. I think that President Putin most probably would have wanted to go, if only out of courtesy to his friend Prime Minister Modi of India. But with President Xi Jinping not going to Delhi, I think it would have been difficult for President Putin to go, and that is why he's decided also to stay away. So lots of diplomatic moves going on. The rest of the world, as I said, isn't waiting solely on what happens in Ukraine. But Ukraine remains the epicenter of the global crisis, and the West, as I discussed, is still uncertain about what to do. Pretending that things are going well when they're not is not the way. Some people understand this. We see this article by Frank Ledwidge, and there have been others. And we'll see what happens over the next couple of days and weeks. Now, it remains always a volatile situation on the battlefronts. Perhaps the Ukrainians will, in defiance of my own expectations, pull something off over the next few days on the southern front lines, which might change the political temperature. I'm sceptical that they can. I think most people who are observing events are also sceptical about that. Time is running out. We're now in September. Most of the stocks of shells, I suspect, will have been used up by now. And of course, the autumn rains and the Rasputitsa are only weeks away. So prospects of a breakthrough all the way to Tokmak and Melitopol are probably receding. But anyway, if something like that happens, obviously I will cover it in my next program. But all the indications so far that I can see is that Ukraine continues to be stuck, and so is the West. So that's me for today. Let me say again, you can find our programs on our major alternative platforms, especially Locals and Rumble. Before long, as I said, I'll be there on X, what was formerly Twitter as well. I'm still finding my way around that. Remember also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of amazing things, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to check your subscription to this channel and to tick also the like button. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.